Hi.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, Christina. Hi,
Hello.
Tina.
Hi.
Uh,
Welcome, Christina.
Thank you for having me.
so, welcome all to the Talking Back to Suicide, where we share lived experiences around mental health and perhaps also suicidal thinking, suicidal attempts, as well as ways to help, and also the idea of arts can play a role in healing as well. I think, Christina, you and I go back a number of years, right? And we had met, tell me if I'm right, we met, I think, on Upwork, the freelance site, right, where you had reached out about a poem lyric, to be the singer songwriter. And I was so impressed by you that I reached out to you, right? Yeah. So, Christina, you can start anywhere you like in terms of who you are, your interests, your passions, and as well your mental health story and journey.
Okay. So I'll keep it relatively brief to start. So my name is Christina DeJury, but I am also known as Crispy Dorado under many platforms as a musician, singer, songwriter, producer, all that good stuff. And Crispy Dorado kind of started all the way back in 2021. And so since then, I've just been slowly building up an audience. Essentially focused on obviously good music, but more importantly, like how music and mental health kind of coincide. That's been a big portion of just my story as I've developed it over the past few years. But since then, it's just been going through life and writing music that relates to that life. And there's been many, many, many changes in my life since I first began, which I think many people can attest to, just constantly changing and not really knowing what's going to come next. So that's just kind of where I've been at now for the past 4 years of Crispy Dorado's conception, just basically going with the flow and creating any and every kind of music that I feel is relevant to me at any given moment in hopes that other people can relate as well.
And from what we've shared in the past, I know, Christina, that um, you've had some intense mental health experiences, right? Could you begin to share a bit about that?
Sure. So basically, I want to say it happened initially in high school where things started to get a little bit iffy. Now I'm 28, so it's been a good number of years since then. But I struggled with, let's see, a laundry list. The main things that I struggled with were borderline personality disorder. I had an anxiety disorder, essentially panic disorder. I learned that I had bipolar as well. So, and ADHD. So, like, really, those four things, which, mind you, took a long time to even figure out what exactly those things were. Those were like the big four that kind of really complicated things for many, many years. It led to hospitalizations in inpatient settings and just all sorts of many, many doctors that some I was more fond of than others, to say the least, but it just became a very large portion of my life, if not my whole life for a while, to the point where at certain points I was unemployed for almost 3 years, just trying to navigate these extremely difficult things all happening at once, between seeing the doctors, being unemployed, going in and out of hospitals. It just became a very large portion of my life for many, many years. So that's kind of where it began, was from high school onward. And then I'm thankful to say, though, in the past couple of years now, things have really taken a turn for the better, which I think is just due in part to also growing up, leaving the adolescence and young adulthood that just makes things that much more complicated.
Looking back, before high school, um, do you think there were early warning signs or something? I mean, hindsight can be 100%, right? And we live our life forward, right? Not going backwards. But looking back at those early years, was there anything that sticks out for you in terms of, oh, that might have been this?
I mean, it's interesting because like I grew up in a very good household. My parents are very loving. My sister was, we were sisters, so we bickered here and there, but it wasn't like an extremely toxic home environment by any means. I think a big thing that I can say going back is just that I always felt a bit like an outcast. My relationships with friends throughout, especially like middle school, before things really started to take a turn, they were always a bit unstable in a sense. Like we were a super close knit group of friends, and then it was never just like we never just fizzled away. It always kind of became this big point of contention and a big blow up, and then, oh, the friendship is done. And it was just thinking back, a lot of the relationships that I had were very, what's the best way to describe it? I guess just rocky. They were always rocky. They were either extremely super tight and the best of friends, or it was just this big explosion of butting heads. Between that and just always, and I think that led to me feeling a bit like an outcast, where I never truly just had one solid group of friends for an extended period of time. And even if that friend group was still together, I wasn't a part of it anymore. And a big portion of that made me think, well, what's wrong with me? Um, so in hindsight, I would say just recognizing that my friendships were never particularly stable and I was always switching around from friend group to friend group and subsequently my identity with that. That's probably the best thing that I can say. I don't necessarily know if there was like a specific trigger. I think it was just noticing that as I grew up. But in terms of my home life, it was never toxic. There was never any one moment that I'm just like, that was probably it.
When you were younger, would you share with your mom or your dad, like, oh, my friend and I had a falling out, or what was it like potentially? Were you able to share some of these things with them? And if yes, how did they respond?
Yeah, I was definitely able to share. I don't know how open I was necessarily, but I also just think my parents were always involved in my mental health journey from the start. I never had an issue. I was never afraid to talk to them about certain things. Um, I think one of the only things that I can note was, I guess, not necessarily in terms of friendships, but just in terms of myself and how I felt about my body as any young girl goes through their self-conscious phase and whatnot. Um, I mean, yeah, Rick, for the most part, there was really no major issues in terms of chatting to them about it. Maybe it's just that they didn't fully understand where I was coming from with a lot of my concerns and feeling upset or confused about certain things, but by no means were they dismissive. It was just I maybe didn't know how to communicate it myself. So it just never felt like there wasn't like help in the way that I felt like I needed, but I don't think it was a fault of their own. I think it was just everybody was trying to navigate how I was feeling and how my relationships were going all at the same time.
Sometimes there can be, I don't know, backstabbing or bullying, girls talking amongst themselves. Did that at all affect you in terms of friendship breakups?
Oh, boy, did it. There was, I could tell you there was this one specific time. This was in high school. So at this point, I'm already dealing with and being more aware of mental health and how it's impacting me. But long story short, I was the lead in the drama that year, my senior year, and I had this big issue where I confided in the one friend that I thought I could confide in about me partaking in some less than desirable self-harm activities, essentially the day of the opening show. I thought I could trust them. Turns out I couldn't, and they reported me to the administration, who, took me out of the show 2 hours before the debut. So, having a friend like that that you thought you could confide in that proceeds to just completely go behind your back and, you know, it just kind of made everything that much worse. And again, they're a friend, they have this information and they don't know what to do with it. But I thought I could confide in them because they were also dealing with their own issues in terms of self-harm, hoping that they would understand, but obviously that backfired immensely, and then the rest of my senior year just kind of became a bit of a chaotic mess, especially with um, the student director for that show, who for the rest of the year basically made it their mission to just continue talking behind my back. And thankfully, I didn't let it get to me too much, but I would be lying to say that it didn't bother me at all. Just being frustrated by this constant drama behind my back about something that, in the end, was really just a student going through a mental health crisis that needed a bit more help than punishment. So that's like the one thing I can really say. Yeah, that was a year full of backstabbing and talking behind backs that was not ideal, not the easiest to work through, but thankfully, I could have responded worse than I did.
What do you mean when you say you could have responded worse?
I mean, I could have done the same thing and like constantly been talking or complaining about this person, or just I'm not somebody who likes to go out of their way to complain about others. Um, Especially like when I was younger, I always had this overwhelming fear that I would be seen in a negative light, and talking about people behind their backs would definitely contribute to being seen in a negative light. So I tried my best, and I'm sure, as all teen girls do, we're not perfect, but I know for a fact that I never went out of my way to make her seem like a bad person, whereas I feel like she kind of made that a bit of her mission. Um, just because, she had to go through a bunch of crap because of what happened to me as well. But, like I tried my best to not put my own shortcomings about the situation outward. I internalized them a lot more rather than put them on others.
Only if you feel comfortable in sharing this. When you say that there was some self-harm activity, was it related to self-cutting or it was something else?
Yeah.
And in sharing with your friend, what was it that you were wanting her support and understanding, or did you want her to do something else with what she had shared with you? Meaning, like, what was your hope or expectation or need in letting her know, what was going on?
I think it, I mean, I guess in retrospect, you think of it almost like you just have this huge secret. Cause like basically what happened was I brought like a shower razor to school that day. And my plan was essentially to harm myself in the last period right before the show after school. Um, and again, this is a friend who at the time also partook in that kind of behavior, even in school. And so I don't know if it was necessarily a cry for help because I don't know what they could have done, but maybe it was just that I was dealing with an extremely heavy thing that I was not able to keep to myself. And I figured that she was the one person that I would be able to confide this in. In hindsight, I shouldn't have said anything to anyone, obviously, but it was what it was at the time. And I was just a confused, desperate, emotionally complicated teenager who could not keep it all to myself. So,
Related to that, she shared it with a counselor, and then there was a decision made to take you out of the play.
yeah, it was actually interesting because she originally actually brought it up to the director, who was also the English teacher. So she brought it up to him, and he, which I actually respected a lot, even in hindsight, that he knew that this was going to happen. She told him that I was going to do this, but he kind of almost understood, yes, this is not a good thing. But suddenly letting administration and everybody know is only going to further complicate this. Like, let it happen for now, acknowledge it's not great, but we'll deal with it after before things get chaotic. And she ignored that and went straight to administration. And then from there, they called me down to the superintendent's office. um, Quite literally, I heard the call because my last period was a free period, and I had just done the thing in the bathroom, and I heard the call just as I was done saying, "Can you send Christina to the main office?" And I was like, "Oh no," my heart sunk. And so right then and there, the nurse evaluated me. The superintendent basically just said, "You're suspended. You can't participate in this anymore. Sorry. Sucks to suck." And so it was literally 2 hours before the show that administration basically just said, "Get off the campus."
balancing, I think in a way also it shows how complex it can be, right? In terms of providing support, right?
Mhm.
And all the multi factors involved with that, right? Where your parents were also, of course, alerted to what was going on.
Oh yeah, my mom immediately came to the school as, they were deciding what to do and whatnot. Even uh my therapist at the time who sorry, even my therapist at the time called the school and basically said, "What you are doing will cause a lot more damage than you think." Just because she did this thing, and sure, it's against school policy, you need to understand that this is not just a kid who's bringing a weapon to school. This is a kid who needs help and not immediate punishment. So my mom was on board with me. She was distraught. My therapist was on board with me and was heavily advocating that disciplinary action could be taken later. But right now, in this moment, an hour before the show that she spent months of preparing for, to revoke that from her would cause irreparable damage. And lo and behold, it did. But yeah, it was just a very complicated situation where the school is trying to follow policy because I had technically a weapon. Um, Therefore, I was a danger to myself and others, according to the policy. But at the same time, it wasn't like I was going to go out and cause harm to anyone else but myself. So it was a very complicated situation that kind of ended up being the worst possible outcome at the time.
Imagine they were also speaking from their perspective, medical, legal complications. Would they be liable, for your injury, if you continued in the play? On the other hand, it's like if not being in the play was going to worsen the possibility of your, having self harm. Wow. And that was how many years ago? And it's probably just like yesterday when this
Yeah,
happened.
that was, I want to say 11 years ago now, over a decade. But it's funny how, like, even to this day, I'm obviously a much more functioning person, but I can truly attest to how that specific situation really it followed me for many, many years, heavily affecting a lot of my life from that point on. So funny how that happens, but my therapist was right. That's all I can say.
Could you explain a little bit how that experience followed you?
Mhm. Um, so also for the rest of so that happened, midway through the school year. For the rest of the school year, which was the very last half of my senior year, being with this school district my whole life, I was forced to have a one-on-one aide follow me everywhere I went. So other people had to know that, like, oh, who's this, talking about why this girl has a one-on-one aide all of a sudden and she can't be on her own. And just that whole last half of that very last year really cemented in me this idea that I was a danger to myself and others, essentially a liability. I was a walking liability. And I remember, like, going into college, I always carried that with me, dealing with mental health issues with others and with other school authority members in college, even at work when I was finally able to get a job after college. There was always this thought behind my head that I am just a liability to everybody. And it did not help me be able to work through these issues when the whole time all I can think is, I do one thing wrong and suddenly it's no longer just a me thing. It's affecting everybody else around me in a negative way. So just that whole idea of being a liability was very, it took me until, I want to say, 20 20 2021, probably, before I was even able to kind of let go of that idea.
I know you've been listening
Hey.
intently, right? What are your thoughts?
Hey, Christina.
Hey.
There's a lot of throwback memories for you.
Oh, yeah.
So let's attempt to like get to the root of it all. That's what we're attempting to do with the show because there's so many teenage girls and also boys out there that are asking the same question, what's wrong with me? And if you analyze the trends, it's more common for a teenager who comes from a stable home where there's no toxic at all to suffer with mental illness versus someone who doesn't come from a stable home. And my opinion on it, and I want your take on it, can it be because of the pressure as well, even though it's not toxic, but there can be pressure to do well at school, to fit in, and that can sort of like now create the mental illness that comes with it. Whereas someone who doesn't come from a toxic home is out there and is freely expressing themselves, where now there's less anxiety, there's less depression. What would you say about that?
I think partially that, where it's just like you do feel this pressure to stay on top of yourself coming from a good household. And when you don't feel okay, you wonder why. Like, everything's been fine. Why do I still feel this way? And you internalize that whole "what is wrong with me" idea. Something else that I've noticed throughout my life is I wonder how much it has to do with somebody who has had a good household doesn't I'm trying to find like a good way to word this, but it's sort of like they don't, or rather, let's say somebody who comes from a broken household, a lot of their issues tend to be external: conflict with others, broken family in terms of just their parents, their siblings, their anyone. Whereas somebody who has come from a less broken household, it's almost like they have, I guess the best way to say it is like they have more time to internalize these things, whereas somebody who's coming from a broken household is forced to deal with the external factors. It's kind of like the same thing where I say, and this is on a very extreme scale, but somebody who is fighting for their life in terms of they're homeless, or they don't have any money to survive. It's a lot. I feel like it's a lot harder to. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, of course, but you're not able to focus on these the mental turmoil as much when it's like you need to think about what are you going to eat next. Um, and I find and I say that because for myself, again, I still come from a very blessed situation. My parents, even though I live on my own now, my parents are never going to let me go to the street. I can always go back. But it's even that slight mentality shift where now that I am on my own, I feel like that's been significantly helpful to my mental health, because suddenly it's like I have this responsibility to keep myself sustained, and I can't just sit and dwell on things internally anymore. So I wonder how much just the idea that the internal versus external factor of where that point of, because everyone's got to deal with something. But if it's not on the external, then it usually ends up more on the internal and vice versa. And they all, they intermingle. Nothing is black and white. But I wonder how much that can have to do with the whole idea of where these things come from for everybody.
Yeah. As I said, just like a common trend that I see happening in society. It's mostly the teenagers or people that come from a stable home or come from a wealthy household that tend to suffer with anxiety or mental illness the most.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something going on there, versus someone who doesn't. But you're correct in saying, we express ourselves externally, if you come from a broken home. That's true. You get into unnecessary fights or you'll shoplift, something of the sort. But nothing is really going on internally. Absolutely nothing. But being like a gifted person from small, like you're an artist, okay? Did you ever find it difficult to express yourself? Do you feel maybe that could have also played a role in the mental illness? Did you have that opportunity to express yourself as a gifted individual growing up?
Pretty much always. Yeah. I was always in school. I was always the music kid in every ensemble I could be in, and making music on my own time. I would say from 5th grade on is when I really dove into music. But I was, I did dance as a little kid. I was always in music. There was always ways that I could express myself. Maybe not always in the ways that I wanted to, but I always was surrounded with music, and that really became my main source of self-expression as I grew up.
Yeah. Diana, being a child psychiatrist, based on what I just said, have you ever had this sort of situations? Just curious, with children,
Yeah, having a lot of
multiverses,
thoughts. You're
broken.
inspiring me, Christina, with what you're sharing. Um, that I guess I would be in the middle ground of the external and the internal impacting each other back and forth, right? Uh, I was thinking about, you mentioned ADHD, attention deficit, right? Hyperactivity disorder, which is like the umbrella under which you could have someone who, for no other specific cause, is having difficulty paying attention. So it doesn't have to be the hyperactivity part or the impulsivity, which is part of the symptoms of it. It could be purely attention. And the reason I'm mentioning that, like no other specific cause, it could be, let's say, someone has a learning disorder, right? And because of that, they're having difficulty paying attention, or they have an eyesight problem, right? Or there's another health problem, or maybe there's, I don't know, abuse going on in the home and they're just distracted and unhappy because that needs to be addressed. So, things have to be sorted out. And then there's the ADHD, where it is attention, physical activity, and impulsivity. So it's the three of those things going on. So I wanted to ask you about the ADHD kind of diagnosis, because that it's easier to pick up on when there's the physical activity. Yeah, because the kid is so restless. And I also want to say that if medication were to be prescribed, and that is the number one intervention for ADHD, it has to be given very thoughtfully. There's too much over prescribing, right? And I'm not at all for over prescribing, but from my experience, and I think from others, there's clearly examples where a youngster has ADHD. I can remember, like, young children, like a cyclone of activity in my office. It just could not sit still. And this was not related to being anxious or not wanting to be there. It was purely out of the kid's control. But usually this is picked up early on in a child's life. I think it's also more so evident, maybe because of the ADHD being the physical and the impulsivity, shouting out, not waiting your turn, things like that, with boys. So there can be a differential between how it's picked up and how it manifests between females and males. So I wanted to ask you about, amongst many questions, about the ADHD, because that can impact academic understanding and performance and learning, because the kid may be wanting to learn, exceptionally interested, bright, but if you can't pay attention for very long, it's going to be difficult to learn. And also it can impact a person when they're young and even older socially, right? Because if you're not paying attention, or you're impulsive, or you can't, you're physically touching the person because you kind of can't control your physical movements, it can affect the way a person, you can't, in games, you're not playing by the rules because you're impulsive. It can affect your social interaction through no fault of your own. And so it's impacting friendships, in part because of ADHD. So I'm curious what that was like for you early on, and how old you were when someone said, hey, maybe there's ADHD going
on. So as a kid, so first of all, it took until my adulthood to actually get like a formal diagnosis in ADHD. So it took quite a while for me. But as a kid, I can definitely attest to the idea of hyperfocus. Especially in the sense of music. I could hyper focus on music for, like, there was no tomorrow. I would get sucked into things for hours on end and not even realize how long it's been. But then it came to other classes and it was just like trudging through the mud, trying to stay focused. I had no ability to study. I was the classic case of the gifted kid syndrome where you just kind of coasted by for a long time, just off of natural problem solving abilities and whatnot. But I'd never learned how to study because of that. And it really did affect just my ability to comfortably get through classes. And it's funny because in the end, I still graduated with a really high GPA, but it was definitely a bit of a challenge in the subjects I was less interested in to perform well or do well in any way, because I just, not only was it hard for me to engage in the first place, but I wasn't even really able to just sit down and study and get it done because I could not focus on the studying, nor did I really even learn how to study. Um, so that was definitely a big thing that impacted me as a child in school, um, as well as just I couldn't sit still for anything. To this day, I've been doing really well because my hands are down here doing their own thing. But normally, I am constantly doing this with my hair. It never stops. And in school, it was always something like that, some kind of tick or some kind of motor thing that I constantly needed to be doing. And I felt like uncomfortable if I couldn't do it. So yeah, that whole idea though of hyper focus really carried off all the way into college, and there were definitely a lot of scenarios with friends where I had that impulsivity as well. Um, I guess I was just unaware of I guess I was just unaware of myself and how I was coming across in a lot of scenarios where I would think that we were having fun doing something, and it turns out that nobody else was having fun and I was pushing it too far. It happened once, I can say, in college where we were all walking to a dorm, and I don't remember what ended up causing it, but I guess there was just like a gentle little, like one of my friends gently shoved another friend jokingly or whatever. And I didn't really pick up on the cue that, hey, maybe you're not supposed to shove other people, but I shoved someone else and they fell into the snow. And then they all turned to me to say, what the hell is wrong with you? And then I was just crushed. And it was kind of scenarios like that where I would kind of act out thinking it was a part of the whole social nature of what was happening, but I completely misread the situation. And then all of a sudden, it's kind of just like the what's wrong with you scenario that it happened more times than I'd like to admit.
Early on, were you telling yourself something about the difficulty? There was a hyper focus in areas of interest, but otherwise difficulty focusing on studying. Was there difficulty completing things like finishing the homework, remembering to hand the homework in?
Um, it's funny that I almost can't even remember how my my homework went. I feel like if anything, I was usually able to hand it in, but I was procrastinating to the last possible second and just getting it done to be able to get it done. Um, that's really where a lot of it came from. It was this pressure if I still wanted to be a good student, I still wanted to perform well, but I was just not really able to in a traditional sense. So that was a big thing for me in homework. I remember specifically was at the very least, the procrastination was off the charts until the last possible second. And then there's that whole gifted kid syndrome side of things where I was able to fake it and it was fine and everything went well and I passed and it was great, but no actual like foundational skills of learning were particularly established around that time. It was just me being able to skirt by, faking my way through the procrastination to get it done.
And were you at any time saying, "Well, I'm just that kind of person. I like to do things at the last moment," or pressure makes me, do better, or there's something wrong with me, or you know, was there any? And I know as young people, it's hard for us to self-reflect, right? We learn that skill hopefully as we get older. But were you telling yourself something when you were younger?
I feel like I definitely resonated with the idea of just I'm a last minute kind of person. That's about as far as I can remember specifically. I know as I got a little bit older, I would always say that I'm good under pressure. Like like if I had a deadline for something, I would not be able to focus on it for the life of me. Let's say we had a week to complete something. I wouldn't pick it up. I wouldn't pick up the book to read until the last half of the last day. And in that last half of the last day, there was a lot of pressure to get it done. So I was able to quickly knock it out. But if you told me to sit down and, prepare for something with any actually constructive time ahead of time, that it couldn't happen. I just couldn't. I could not find that focus and that ability to just do it ahead of time.
And how were you finally diagnosed with having ADHD? You said it was when you were an adult.
Yeah, well, I guess young adult. I want to say it was when I was 18, 19. So I guess still a kid technically, but in the sense of I was no longer in the adolescent care side of psychiatric things. And that's when they kind of originally threw out the diagnosis, as they did with the bipolar and the BPD. And none of it was fully like concrete until a couple of years later in 2019, maybe. That I was given like the formal, okay, we figured it out. We thought it was maybe these for a couple of years, but now we know for sure it is A, B, and C. So, and that's the thing, is I didn't even get treatment for the ADHD until this past year, 2 years ago. So it was kind of just something that I always just figured, it's just something I have and it's always how it's been. But in the past 2 years is when I finally was like, all right, maybe I can actually get this under control, because clearly just letting it go wild is not helping.
And did the treatment include medication or other things?
Mainly medication. I started out originally trying non-stimulant medication because I had really bad sleeping patterns at the time. So they're like, let's not bother with the stimulants. And none of those really worked. So I tried my best then for another year or so to not have any medication and just try more hands-on schedule making, like visual reminders and things like that. That didn't really help either, because I noticed I was getting a lot of really bad paralysis, knowing what I need to do, but not really able to do it. And then it's funny, actually, I figured out to actually try doing a stimulant medication after my first bodybuilding show, which was last January, just over a year ago. And I'm not saying this was a healthy thing, because bodybuilding at the competition level is not healthy, but I was consuming copious amounts of caffeine at the time. This was before any medication. And I noticed, I was like, when I stopped after the show and I stopped consuming that much caffeine, I was like, wow, my focus stinks. It was a lot better just a couple of months ago when I was on all that caffeine. So I finally reached out to my doctor again and I was like, my sleep schedule has been better. Do you think we can try a stimulant medication now? And it ended up actually helping. So thanks to my bodybuilding and copious caffeine consumption, that kind of helped me figure out which medication was right for me. Not saying anyone should consume that much caffeine, but it did make me realize how much the stimulant actually did help once my sleep was under control first.
And earlier on, Christina, you were talking about that there had been inpatient admissions and other types of treatment. Could you kind of go back in time and talk a bit about that? What led to those admissions?
Mm-hmm. So the first one started when I was 17. I want to say the first one was right before my senior year. Or what was it? That's the thing, is it's such a blur after this long that, and you almost I can't even, I used to be able to say, yeah, I was here at this time and this time and this year, and it's kind of all blurred together over the years, but I was there twice as an adolescent. Actually, yeah, the first time was the summer before my senior year. The second time was amidst my senior year. The second time was actually, during rehearsal time for the show. So the fact that I was even able to stay on top of rehearsing my lines in the hospital meant, that's where that whole idea of it was really detrimental to take me out of that show, going back to that. But there were 2 times as a senior, still in the adolescent side of things, when I was 17. And then when I was 18, there was one time when I was 19, pretty much like there was almost between actual inpatient and just like CPAP kind of things with the emergency side. There were about 9 or 10 times up until 2020. Yeah, 2020. The last time I ever went was right in the middle of the pandemic. So that was an experience. But pretty much every occasion that I was hospitalized was due to self harm. That's kind of what got me to the hospital in the first place. And then from there, they were just like, all right, well, you're going. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Some stays were only a couple of days. I was at a residential facility for 3 to 4 weeks at one point. But then, ironically, most of my inpatient stays, I was discharged AMA from quite a few of them because it just, I felt like I needed more outside help. I found being in the hospitals didn't always work out well for me. Not to say it didn't initially help, but quite a few of those scenarios, I did find that I didn't need to be inpatient. I just needed more hands-on treatment outside of the hospital. But there's been quite a number of times, pretty much all related to self-harm.
Nodding your head, right?
I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you, Christina, and I'm intaking it all, I'm digesting it, and I'm just thinking to myself, and now I'm also going to like bring my life growing up as well into the conversation. I've had my fair share of mental illness, but like, because I've put like so much awareness on it at certain periods in my life growing up, there wasn't anything really wrong with me. And I'm sitting and thinking there wasn't really anything wrong with you as well. Even though we may have seen the way, like how you said the doctors changed the labels later on. You had ABC, then it got changed to ABC. I just feel like, teenagers, suffering with mental illness at the moment is just because the system doesn't know how to handle them at the moment. It's gifted individuals. They built different. You were built different. You went through different phases because you couldn't adjust to how the traditional system was operating. Neither could I. And then we were labeled as, look, there's something wrong with you. And then subconsciously, I also took it into my own life, thinking, yeah, there is something wrong with me. And I need to take this medication. I need to see this doctor and that doctor. And when I look at it now, grown up, I mean, my adulthood, there wasn't anything really wrong with me. I was manifesting who I was supposed to become. And it's different to how 99% of the world is.
Mhm.
It's controversial. What I'm saying is controversial. A lot of people will disapprove of what I'm saying, but I'm just trying to make sense of it all.
I mean, I think what you're saying about you don't fit, and it's not a problem to not fit. It's just that navigating the fact that you need to go a different direction than where most people go it's difficult for an adolescent mind to comprehend. They can't. They're not meant to yet. I mean, for me, it's like that was how I felt for most of my life. And funnily enough, it was when I turned between 25 and 26, and all of a sudden my brain is more developed and it hits that point. And so much of it kind of fell into place. And that's not to say I was like, oh, I'm better. I'm old and I'm an adult and I can think rationally now. But it's funny how as soon as my brain hit that point of maturity that we're supposed to hit around that age, my entire perspective on it changed, where it was I mean, you still have the issues where I think like, God damn it, like what's wrong with me in this case? But it was never like when I was a teenager, it felt like the end of the world every single time. And it was just this overly dramatic, just devastation that I felt for my own existence. And nowadays it's just kind of like, I'm able to sit with it a lot more and acknowledge like what you said about I'm on a different path than a lot of other people, and navigating that is going to be different for me, but it's not the end of the world like I thought it was when I was much younger.
The world is going to think you're crazy, but you're actually not. And you're not in a loony bin, When you hit 25, 26, you weren't in a loony bin, So what really was wrong with you, like from a medical point of view? Yeah. I just feel, there's this thing about pressure again. Even if it's, conscious, subconsciously, If we just allow kids to just like freely express themselves, and I mean, not even our parents could figure out why are we acting differently. Why don't we just fit in with the rest of the kids? We're getting judged. The teachers are judging us. The kids who are fitting in, their parents are judging us because they don't even have that understanding. Then also now, you get that pressure, and that increases. Okay, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And it's disastrous.
That it can be. But it is like just that internalization as a kid. I think it comes with everyone. It just, how does it manifest for each kid is different. Some cases are more extreme than others, but it's, yeah, I just, that pressure, I think when you were talking about just the whole pressure of fitting in, I really resonate with that, because that's where a big portion of like my own internal shame came from, is just that inability. And I think so many kids internalize that shame, but we're not able to
Yeah.
express it. And so it just becomes a challenge for everyone involved. I think one of the first things that I said way back at the beginning of our talk was that, like, I would express to my parents these things that were, not sitting right with me. But as a kid, I don't know how to express it. They're not translators, they can't necessarily just assume what I'm saying and understand when I'm a kid who's still trying to figure out how to express it in the first place. And it just becomes that cycle of feeling that shame, not knowing how to express that shame, people not being able to necessarily help in the way that you need them to, but you also don't know how to tell them how to help. And it just becomes this kind of whirlwind that I think is just so difficult for so many adolescent people to navigate. And as you get older and suddenly you're able to start expressing it's funny how a lot of things really start to fall into place for the better. At least they did for me.
Yeah.
In the self-cutting that was going on, I wanted to ask you, one, like, how young were you and how did it start? And maybe also even the purpose or the motivation. I know that for myself, thankfully, I never engaged in self-cutting. I myself am diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder. I attempted suicide when I was in medical school and was medically hospitalized. But I have experienced, I would say even many times, but not in a continual way, but many times I've experienced an intense feeling of wanting to cut myself. I did not engage to do that, but I had a very strong feeling of wanting to do that. And it was related to a feeling like this upset, pain, some terrible feeling I had inside of me that somehow if I cut myself, then it would get out somehow. I can't quite explain it. But what was it like for you? Because in having strong feelings, I mean, not everybody experiences events the same way or has the same reaction. And there's some people can feel things more strongly, right? And then it becomes, well, how do we cope with having those strong feelings? And some people start to engage in cutting as a way to, in a sense, to make themselves feel better. Although ultimately that is not the way to feel better and can cycle into a whole shame cycle about the cutting. And I can even remember meeting a young adult who thankfully was no longer cutting, but she had cut herself so many times. She had scars all over her body. And even looking at her own body brought back so many terrible feelings for her. And even, it's summer, I can't wear shorts, I can't show people my arms. And for so many reasons, cutting oneself is not the way we want someone to start that path, right? So could you say something about the cutting and what that was like for you? And maybe even offer suggestions if somebody is having that urge?
Mm-hmm. So for me, the first time I ever started or tried it in the first place was because I was an impressionable teenager when I was like 14, 15. And I saw a friend doing it. So I was like, let me try it. And that was kind of the beginning. I at that very moment, I learned, I have an addictive personality. And I started small, as many people do. It's a scary thing when you're first trying this thing that is so considered taboo, which, I mean, it's not obviously a good thing in any means, but when you, like, the first time I tried it was mostly, I was already dealing with mental health issues, but it was almost more of a curiosity that I know other people do this when they feel this way, so I'm going to try it. A completely uninformed teenager. Um, and I noticed that it became a distraction for me over time. I know that, like, on a chemical level, it can release endorphins to experience that feeling and to see what it's doing in the moment.
Here we go.
Well, yeah, welcome back.
Right? Yeah, you're back.
I miss you guys.
I'm still thinking, Christine, of what you said. You went to the hospital because of, what was it, 14 stitches needing it for a large wound?
Yeah, that was one of them. There were many. There was one scenario that was one of the worst PTSD moments of my life because of a, self-harm hospital treatment situation. Like, it's funny how as a, naive kid, you think, oh, this will help. This will be fine. It's going to make things feel better and I'll feel fine once I cut. And then suddenly a couple years down the road and the cutting ends up becoming more than half of the issue and it leads to more complications. I mean, that's what happened when the school found out about everything that was due to cutting. And the same thing in college, I got taken away in an ambulance from the campus to a hospital because of cutting. And it's crazy how just it starts out as such a, I wouldn't say innocent thing, because I'll just say a naive, misinformed thing as a teenager. And it just spirals from there and ends up becoming more of the problem than you ever thought it could be as a solution.
As you're speaking, I was thinking of also with what social media and the algorithms, right? That a person can be fed all sorts of videos and misinformation glorifying cutting, whereas it's going to worsen your mental health, right? Not improve it. And it's just tragic what can happen to someone.
I 100% blame Tumblr in 2008, 2009. I'm a kid without much, I'm a kid with unrestricted internet access in middle school, as we all were in, late middle school, early high school. And our parents did not know what we were doing. They barely knew how to turn the computers on sometimes. And here I am going on websites that they had no idea I was going on and looking at blogs of people sharing their self-injury and other people glorifying it, and just these like eating disorder communities where they're all talking about this terrible stuff with their eating disorders. And then oh man, boy, did it do something to my brain as a teenager that did not help at all. And I can't even imagine how it is now, because now I feel like I'm the outdated one where all these kids are on these new apps and these new forums that I probably don't even know exist. So I can't imagine how it's still affecting kids nowadays. But I can even say for myself, like, it was heavily impactful and not in the good way.
You had also mentioned, Christine, about borderline personality disorder, as well as the bipolar disorder. And I know it can be possible a person could have both, perhaps, but sometimes there can be and I'm not saying this in your situation, but sometimes there can be a misdiagnosis, right? That someone in either direction, a person could be diagnosed with borderline personality, whereas it's not their personality, it's a mood disorder of a bipolar type. Could you say something about the symptoms that you were manifesting and your thoughts about those diagnoses?
Yeah. So borderline came first as like the confirmed diagnosis. Bipolar was mentioned, but it wasn't until a couple of years later that that was also confirmed. Um, but for me, a lot of the borderline symptoms that came about for me was, for one, this very unstable, rocky relationships that came out of a lot of impulsivity on my end. I had no regard for my own safety. I did a lot of stupid things, as a lot of kids do, like, trying to be a cool, edgy teenager exploring. Like, there's an abandoned hospital in the town I grew up in, and we would explore and have no care in the world for the stupid things we'd be doing. And every kid does that, but I feel like I definitely took it to a bit of an extreme in just disregard for my own safety. I always had the rocky relationships with a lot of people. I always had this constant, deep internalized shame that I could not understand or figure out. Those were kind of the big telltale signs to say, she might have a little bit of a borderline personality there. And I developed this deep fear of abandonment, which I think is what also caused a lot of rocky, unstable relationships for me. Just that whole idea where, especially when it came to romantic ones and interests, is I would be infatuated with someone, complete idolization. And then I think that whole internalized shame factor of, well, there's something wrong with me and I'm a liability, so I'm better off just letting them go before it gets too bad. But then they start to go, and then suddenly I'm like, no, wait, what have I done? And it just became this endless cycle of that fear of abandonment constantly playing out, along with that idea of shame and not knowing how to handle it. I would always be splitting on people, complete infatuation. They do one tiny thing that I didn't like, enemy, complete enemy, worst person in the world to me. So, deep contrast between those kinds of emotions. And then I noticed, Ollie is snoring next to me. I don't know if you can hear that. But yeah, then the bipolar came about when I noticed that I would be going through these large phases of moods. So on one hand, I've got these tiny little, like, moment to moment mood swings because of the borderline. But then I noticed that it was also on, like, a multi-week basis that I was really going through these larger swings of feeling like I am the absolute greatest person ever, and I'm gonna drop everything and go out to Arizona because why not? It'll be a fun, adventurous new start. And then 2 weeks later, I'm laying in my bed face down, just wondering why I exist. Deep contrast between those two. But to have these large swings and then these small little spikes in between, it just, like, when I'd have a large swing and I'd have a little spike on the top, it just amplified it. Same thing on the bottom half. If I was in a depressive state already because of the bipolar, and I just got, like, a depressive little moment because of my borderline, it amplified it to the extreme on the negative side. So it was a really complicated situation trying to figure out what was happening when the mood was just so incredibly unstable for so long on both a small and a large scale.
During those times of going down, were there suicidal thoughts or suicidal attempts?
Oh, yeah. Pretty much constant suicidal ideation, especially on the low end. Um, it was there was like one like it was funny because, like, well, not funny, ironic that I always had this constant suicidal ideation, but when it came to, like, self-injury and whatnot, there was always this fear in the back of my head around it all where I would get to this super low point and I would want to harm myself. And I would take it to quite an extreme, but there was always this fear that I could never really go all the way, I guess, to say with it. There was always this fear in the back of my head that I couldn't commit. So I ended up just getting these really terrible self-injurious scars, but I was never able to just do it with that kind of final intention, I guess. There was one time that I finally built up the courage to try and whatnot, and it was essentially over the edge of a building, and I was pulled back in time. So, that obviously couldn't follow through with that one. But there were definitely many instances of trying, but also being too afraid to fully commit. But that was kind of like the norm for.
And I want to say thank God for your fear that held you back from ending your life,
Mhm.
right? Because suicide is not something we can come back from,
Yeah.
right? And look at you now, a number of years later, right? Doing well in your life.
Mhm. And I think a big fear that also came from it was the fact that, like, it was this fear of not just me, like, not even just me not knowing what's beyond, the shame that I'm dealing with now, but that shame that I I had a good life, and I didn't necessarily know what was wrong with me, but how much, what would it do to my mom, who never did anything wrong, only ever tried to help, couldn't really navigate it, but that was a huge, huge thing in the back of my brain, was like my parents, in that no parent ever wants to outlive their child, and who would I be to be that person to do it, to them, kind of feeling. I think that's, in hindsight, that was a huge driving force to instill that just enough fear in me to never really go all the way with a lot of things.
In the treatment that you received for, let's say, the bipolar disorder, were you prescribed medication? And if you were, I know that sometimes, maybe especially true for a creative person, they may start to think, well, in my up phase or hypomanic phase, because mania, which is even higher, can be so disruptive. A person may think they're doing wonderful creative things, but most likely they're not, because they're so disorganized in their thinking. But sometimes a person who's bipolar and creative starts to wonder or worry, like, oh no, if my mood becomes stable with medicine, I'm no longer going to be creative. And that could mean the person doesn't want to try a medicine that might actually help them and might actually improve their creativity. So, did that play out at all with you?
It definitely did. I definitely was afraid at first, because I definitely was productive in a hypomanic state. I don't think I ever experienced a full-blown mania, thankfully, but constant, hypomanic states for sure. And I was definitely extremely creative. I wasn't sleeping for, the entire night, but I'm writing a whole piece in a night. Then I do it again the next night, rinse and repeat. And it was it was great until I hit that depressive swing where I would basically undo all of the progress that I had made during the initial phase of hypomania. And I think I had hit a point where I had just kind of decided that it was more worth it to try to find, just to see if that stable place would at least let me not sabotage everything that I do every time I am creative. Like, I had released an album 2021, I want to say, and I had recorded it mostly during like a hypomanic thing where I'm not sleeping much and I'm getting it done. It was great. And then I'm depressed for a while and then I don't think about it. But then when I'm back in hypomania, I release it. Great. And then a couple years later, in a depressive state, I took everything down. So it just, like, there was no, even if I was making progress on one side, the other side was just so counterproductive that it leveled out anyway. So I ended up just kind of thinking, maybe if I am a bit more stable in general, at least I'll have the chance to maybe not make as much progress, but at least the progress that I do make, I'll be able to keep and maintain and not feel this extreme opposite side swing to just undo all of my progress. And now that I've been medicated for a good 2 years or so, I want to say, maybe 3 years, I don't even remember at this point, but it's interesting how, yeah, like, maybe I haven't made as much progress creatively in the recent years, but there's been so much progress elsewhere that it doesn't even compare. Like, when I was making all this music, yeah, it was great. but I was also unemployed, unable to work because of my anxiety disorder. I was not sleeping or taking care of my body or eating. And it's like, at what cost to make the music? Whereas now, yeah, I wish I had more time to create music because the grass is always greener. But at the very least, like, I'm physically healthy. I moved out. I'm living on my own with my boyfriend, not with my parents. I'm maintaining 2 jobs right now to be able to, make ends meet. And it's a trade-off. Sure, I'm not as creative, but at least I'm healthy and I feel a lot more fulfilled now than I ever did when I was just unemployed and making music all the time. And it was a trade-off that's hard to see when you're still in that creative mode and you love making all the stuff. But in retrospect, it's been, miles more beneficial to me and in my creative process because I'm actually like content with the things I've released. And even if I'm not, I don't look at it and say, well, this is terrible. Let me take it down and never and pretend it never existed. I leave it up and I say, there's things I would do differently. So I'll just do that on the next one. So in the end, I still think I've made more progress as a creative in a stable sense than I ever did, even at the highs of my, hypomania.
What was it difficult to find the right medications that worked? Or right out the bat, was there something that was helping you?
Oh, since 14, I had tried basically a front and back, every line full list of medication, everything you can think of pretty much for anything psychiatric, I pretty much was put on. I think it makes more sense to say what weren't you on than what were you on for a long time. Then I went unmedicated for quite a few years because I had had enough. I was like, nothing is working. There's no point. And things were definitely chaotic at that time, but at least I didn't feel like what I was experiencing was pure. It wasn't, affected by this antidepressant that wasn't actually helping or this, mood stabilizer that was just making me a zombie. Like what I was experiencing was just my body at that time. And so I dealt with that for a while. And then after not being on medication for a good couple of years, my friend, who also has bipolar, was just like, so is it okay if I mention specific medications, by the way? I don't know if I should, does it matter?
Maybe not a specific medication. Thank
So,
you.
yeah. So my friend basically was just like, hey, I've been on this thing for a while. And it's honestly been like, it's taken my bipolar and it just kind of does this. And that's the way she described it. And so I brought the idea to my doctor and I said, hey, would you be willing to, put me on this? Can we try this? And so, they did the initial tests and it was good. So we tried it and it ended up being the one. So I got very lucky in that, like, just due to the relationship with my friend, also being through a similar thing, having their own issues with bipolar. Um, I was willing to try this for myself. And again, I didn't just randomly do it. Like my doctors made sure everything was okay to try it, knowing that it is a medication to help bipolar. Um, and it just happened to be the one. And I was like, wow, who knew it was that easy after all this time trying a million different things? And it's funny how, like, I think the only reason I also figured that this was the right medication was because I had come so far along in my own mental health journey at this point where I was getting a better idea of knowing what I actually needed instead of just trying every recommendation from every psychiatrist, who didn't necessarily know who I was and what I was dealing with. I was getting a lot more knowledge of myself to feel confident in saying, I would like to try this rather than just constantly saying, well, what do you think, doctor? And they didn't know me as well as I knew myself. So, yeah.
I'm thinking how the importance of also of not giving up on the thought that things can get better, right?
Mhm.
But even if, you've been on a lot of different medications, that having a good relationship, right, with your provider, and if it's not working out with a particular provider, maybe think of having a consult with someone else, right?
Mhm.
Always paying attention to the benefit and the risk, right? Hopefully there's minimal to no side effects at all. And also, that if things aren't working out, well, let's not give up. Maybe there's another medication that's going to be a better match. And I'm so glad for you that there was something that was really helpful. Plus, what you said before, that your brain and every young person's brain is continuing to develop and grow, and things are going to get better, how just neurologically speaking, right? But in terms of having, in a sense, a bona fide psychiatric illness, even with the maturation of the brain, that there may need to be additional help. And medications can be helpful, again, with the correct diagnosis, right? And that the medicine is actually helping and it's being given at the lowest, most effective dose without hopefully side effects. I can remember, when I was practicing psychiatry saying, well, I'm not giving up, right? And I don't want you to give up either. Maybe there's something out there that we haven't tried yet. And of course, in addition to medicine, there can be lifestyle changes, right? You mentioned sleep is a very important one, right? What caffeine can be good, but not if we're overdosing on caffeine, right? And if we're having an anxiety disorder or a sleep disorder, as well as creativity, exercise. Do you want to say maybe, Christina, other things that you did in your life that you found were helpful to you?
Sure. Also, and just a little note to the medication. Also, I was on this medication years and years ago, but with another cocktail of everything else, and we had no idea that it was effective. So, just because something doesn't work in one scenario doesn't necessarily mean it
That's
won't work.
true. Mm-hmm.
But additionally, getting my sleep and my eating under control were an incredibly beneficial part to my whole journey, because I guess I've hit many rock bottoms, but the final nail on the head rock bottom for me was the end of 2022, where I broke my ankle in 3 places on impact. And before that happened, I was not sleeping much at all. Lucky to get to bed by 4 a.m, if that. I was dealing with a very tricky eating disorder where I just had an aversion to food. It's just avoidant, restrictive food intake disorder. So I wasn't motivated to just be thin or be afraid of fat. I just genuinely did not. I couldn't eat. I just couldn't. It was such an aversion to the idea of it and the feeling of it. And so between that and not sleeping, my body just was like brittle. And so when my ankle finally just kind of snapped out of nowhere, just from landing from a jump, that was kind of like sitting in my apartment with my foot propped up, healing from this injury by myself in the middle of winter. I was just kind of like, all right, I can't. If I don't, it's either I get through this and I make improvements, or I'm never going to get through it. So that was kind of my rock bottom, to improve my diet, which made a huge difference. Focus on trying to finally get proper, consistent sleep, which is easier said than done for sure, but it's just helped so much in just that ability to emotionally regulate yourself. When your body is not fueled properly, nothing works properly. There's always going to be, they're all working together. So that was a big portion for me. And then also just having a routine made a huge difference, just in a simple lifestyle change, where I was finally able to work again after I got my diet and my sleeping under control. I was finally ready to start working again. And it was a simple job. I was working maintenance at a state park, so it wasn't this super high stakes thing, but it was just a start to dip my toes back into employment and ease my way back in. And I was terrified, mind you, at first, because I wasn't able to work for so long that I didn't know if I'd be able to work again, even though it had been so long. And so just finding that avenue to just dip my toes back in and push through that fear that I was afraid things would happen. My gosh, Ollie, he's so loud. I'm so sorry. But just to push through that fear that I had years ago about not being able to work, and just continuing to kind of stay the course and to not let myself overthink. I was able to maintain I was able to maintain a routine, and that routine ended up getting me to a point where I could eventually save up and move out on my own. And it's the little tiny things, step by step: sleep, diet, eventually routine, eventually consistency with all of it. And now I'm here and feeling a lot better. Also, here's the culprit of the snoring, just so you know. Ugh.
Thank you, Christina, for sharing, right? So much, right? As you were speaking, I was remembering something I heard just recently. Someone was speaking about like the decision between the word decide and to choose. And if I recall correctly, they were saying like if I choose something, it was more like, well, I could choose this or I could choose that, but it was more like open-ended, right? Choosing. And in this person's interpretation, they were talking about the word origin of the word decide. And again, if I recall correctly, it had to do with cutting off, right? And like the decision was more of I'm deciding, there's been a line in the sand, right? And this is what I've decided to do. That it's not like, well, I'm choosing to do it, right? And somehow that resonated with me. Like, am I deciding to be healthy, right? And if I decide to be healthy, then I'm less likely to turn back, right? And choose something else. Like, well, today I don't want to be healthy. I choose not to be healthy today. This sounds like you made a decision during that time of what, not being there. You are in your apartment. I can't move, right? Because of my ankle.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when you said because of a jump, I think you're referring to what, with the rollerblading or the roller skating. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, so I do roller skating, like quad skates, but at a skate park. And so I was filming like a little skate edit with a friend. And basically, I remember specifically I was quite, malnourished at the time, but I didn't care. I had no regard for my health in that sense. So I didn't think much about that. I remember having a panic attack the night before we went. And then the next day, we are skating, and I noticed a little tweak in my foot. I was like, something feels a little off. So I take off my skate, I move my leg around. I'm like, it's fine, whatever. Little did I know, I feel like it was probably like adrenaline making me realize that, or making me not realize that there was probably already a itty bitty little stress fracture. So we go for another line, and I do a drop. I jump down, and on impact, all 3 bones in my ankle just give out. And obviously at that point, it was I was done for the day, to say the least. But I ended up having to get surgery a couple weeks later. I've got some nice pins and screws in my plates in my ankle right now. And I really hit a rock bottom there. But even on a physical sense, just like nowadays, I'm squatting 275, 300, on my shoulders. Just the fact that a couple years ago my ankle was doing this, and now it's supporting that much weight. Like, it's crazy how much things have changed, just even in that sense.
You are an inspiring person, Christina, right? You have done so much, right, in your still young life, right? There's so much more ahead of you.
Oh, and also I think you would appreciate when we first met, I looked a little bit more like this. This
Yes.
also happened from skating. Normally it's glued in, but it popped out the other day, so I figured I should throw it in for now, but it's exposed.
I think where there's life, there's hope,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that hope can also manifest into reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kino, any last questions or comments for Christina?
No, this was insightful. There's a lot to take away from here, to use in our work, especially with that age group, from even 10 to 18. There's a lot of work that needs to happen there. So thank you, Christina, for being so transparent with your life. And, we're just going to take the content from here, analyze it, dissect it, and see what we can do,
Well, thank you so
stop
much for
these.
having me.
Yeah.
I want to
Stop
circle
the
back to something that we talked about early on, about people that experience homelessness, right? Or they're maybe beyond temporarily homeless, that they're living on the streets, that there can be, untreated psychiatric illness in those people, where they may be psychotic, delusional, hallucinations, depression, PTSD, mental illness leading into substance abuse, and that the psychiatric illness combined with lack of resources, whether that's their own inability to have work, right, or the lack of resources that are being able to come to them to help them in that state. So there's that combination of internal preoccupation, right? If I'm hallucinating and delusional and not getting treatment for my mental health, which is severe, I'm losing my job, or I may lose my ability to have my family, and now I'm on the streets. So there's external events, but in that situation, there's also an internal process, right, for to help that individual. But it does go back, interestingly, into the internal and the external. And I think that we have to look at both, right? That both can affect the person. And then as well, there can be, which we haven't much talked about, the idea that there can be familial genetic predisposition, right, to have ADHD or a major depression or a psychotic disorder. I know in my own family that I had an uncle who ended up hospitalized at Bellevue Hospital in New York when he was psychotic, right? And I had rage attacks, psychotic, ended up getting ECT. Looking back, I wonder if he had bipolar 1 disorder, and that was what was going on with him. And that was on my dad's side of the family. And on my mother's side of the family, I also had a very, very talented artist and my beloved aunt who ended up having a severe depression and may have also had some psychotic features. So there can be, we can be primed a little bit in terms of our genetic loading. So all those things need to be taken into consideration. But I also think that idea that I think you personify, Christina, is that that things can improve, our life can improve, right? With your physical health, your emotional health, taking care of yourself, having employment, a positive relationship, and that sometimes medication can play a role for that. And people shouldn't feel badly if they might need to seek out help, right? We all need help, right? And that help can come in many different forms. And sometimes just because previous help didn't work, to the most, maybe there's more out there for us. So we should keep on searching because life can get better.
And that it does.
Yes. Thanks again, Christina.
Thank you as well.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice chatting.
Bye.